On January 14, 2023, Alexander Taratuta was working on his car, fixing something. Later that evening, he returned home, where his wife Anastasia and their 4 children were waiting for him. Tired, he decided to have a glass of beer. It was just an ordinary day, like so many others. But that evening, the lives of everyone in the Taratuta family would change. Alexander found his 3-year-old son, Semyon, lying unconscious on the floor. He picked him up and carried him to the bathroom, splashing him with cold water, trying to wake him, but the child didn't respond. Alexander told Anastasia to call 911. When the paramedics arrived, they had to pronounce the child dead. The doctors noticed abrasions on the boy's head and face. The parents explained that Semyon had fallen and hit his head, which is why he'd felt unwell and lost consciousness.
But is that really the case, or are the parents leaving something out?
Let's find out. Dear viewers of my channel, I write each script for my videos myself, using information from open sources online. I dive deeply into each story. Some videos are very hard on me emotionally, as I process the tragedy and horror of what happened. This story about Semyon Taratuta was particularly difficult for me. As a parent of 2 wonderful children myself, this story felt like a true nightmare. If you appreciate how I present these stories, please show your support by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, clicking the notification bell, and leaving a comment at the end. It helps my videos reach more people and motivates me to continue bringing you stories like this. Alexander and Anastasia Taratuta met 7 years ago online. The Taratuta family lived in Slutsk, Belarus. The child's mother, Anastasia, is Russian with permanent residency in Belarus. She was born in the town of Pudozh in Karelia. Before taking maternity leave, she worked at the Household Services Center of the Slutsk clothing factory. She has 2 sons, 14-year-old Daniil and 12-year-old Myron, who lived with their fathers. After Daniil's father passed away, he moved in with his mother. Anastasia had 3 children with Alexander Taratuta: Gloria, Semyon, and Milena. At first glance, they seemed like an ordinary average family. Anastasia took care of the children and household. Alexander worked at the local market and spent his free time tinkering with his car. On that fateful day, January 14th, 2023, Alexander Taratuta went out to the yard to work on his car. Something needed fixing. Around 1 p.m., he drove to the market. An hour later, he returned home and took care of some household tasks. Around 4 p.m., he decided to have a beer with his wife. His oldest son, Daniil, was playing on the computer. It was getting close to bedtime for their youngest daughter, Milena. Everyone left the room and went to the kitchen. That evening, it was Alexander's turn to put Milena to bed, so he put on some cartoons for her. At that moment, he heard his wife call out from the bathroom, "Ugh, you little mess," followed by some slapping sounds. Anastasia was washing their son, Semyon. 10 minutes later, a scream came from the kitchen. Alexander went into the kitchen and saw Semyon standing there, naked, with a mess on the floor behind him. Anastasia had just washed and fed him, but he had soiled himself, which made her furious. Alexander cleaned up in the kitchen, sat down on a chair, and told his son to get dressed. Then he struck Semyon on the head with his knee, which was wearing a rubber slipper. The boy's legs gave way, and he fell to his side, motionless. His eyes were open, but he showed no signs of life. When Alexander saw blood beginning to flow from one of Semyon's nostrils, he carried him to the bathroom and poured cool water over him, trying to revive him. What was strange was that Anastasia did not react or move to help. She simply got dressed and left the apartment with Daniil. Panicked, Alexander called his brother and told him what had happened, and following his brother's advice, he called for an ambulance. By this time, Anastasia and Daniil had returned, and she asked Alexander for the car keys, intending to take the girls away to hide them. When the paramedics arrived at the scene, they found a recently washed, extremely thin boy who, at 3 years old, weighed less than 22 pounds, 10 kilograms. Sadly, all they could do was pronounce the child dead. The doctors noticed numerous bruises and abrasions on the boy's body, especially around his head and face. The parents claimed that he often fell and that he had fallen and hit his head that evening, which caused him to feel unwell. The doctors doubted the parents' explanation, noticing bloodstains on the floor and walls, and notified the police. The investigative team arrived immediately, taking Alexander and Anastasia in for questioning.
Поднялись в квартиру, увидели, что на тахте лежит полностью голый ребенок с признаками травм в состоянии клинической смерти. Приступили к сердечно-легочной реанимации, но, к сожалению, в течение 32 минут сердце не запустилось.
At the police station, the parents insisted to authorities that their child had simply fallen, hitting his head on the floor, lost consciousness, and started bleeding from his nose. They claimed that they immediately called for an ambulance. Investigators ordered a forensic examination to determine the exact cause of the 3-year-old boy's death. The examination revealed that the boy had died from multiple severe blows to the head. The parents quickly became suspects, and during questioning, they admitted to regularly beating Semyon because he misbehaved and often cried, which irritated them. It was uncovered that this poor child had been abused throughout his short life, all 3 years of it. 3-year-old Semyon Taratuta was an unwanted child in the family. According to the father, Anastasia had wanted only daughters, and they were told too late in the pregnancy that they would have a boy. By then, it was too late to terminate the pregnancy, but the expectant mother, it seems, did everything in her power to prevent the baby from being born. She drank heavily throughout the pregnancy. Immediately after birth, little Semyon was sent to the neonatal intensive care unit, where, as the father put it, he was kept in a glass box. When the baby was finally ready to be discharged 3 months later, the parents filed a request to place the infant in a baby home, since they were renovating their apartment. As a result, little Semyon did not come home until he was 6 months old. Just 2 months later, he was hospitalized again with signs of abuse. The parents themselves took the boy to the hospital, explaining that his head was swelling. Why their baby's head was swelling, they claimed not to know. However, the doctors clearly stated that the child was being abused. According to the investigation, in June and July 2020 alone, Semyon suffered at least 20 blows, 10 of them to his head. He was beaten with hands, feet, and objects. In August, 3 more blows to the head were documented. This is only what the accused admitted. How many more blows this baby, who wasn't even a year old at the time, endured from his loving parents remains unknown. There wasn't an unbruised spot left on his tiny body, yet the mother and father calmly explained that they were just disciplining the child. So what if I cuffed him? So what if I slapped him with a slipper? So what if I kicked him? The father even joked in court. The slipper? It was better for Semyon. It's soft and rubbery. It bounces. The father claimed that only his wife hit the child before he was a year old. Alexander told the court that the kid was too little back then. What was the point of hitting him? Once he turned a year old, however, Alexander believed he finally had plenty of reasons to hit him. He was walking, getting in the way, breaking things, annoying me. In court, he protested indignantly, saying, "Don't make us out to be some awful family. Ours was just a normal family, like anyone else's. In this normal family, they also didn't feed the boy. Being born prematurely, Semyon required special nutritional care and, naturally, more attention. The baby formulas that doctors recommended were too expensive, so his parents decided to ignore his nutritional needs altogether. In fact, they mostly ignored feeding him at all. We were having financial difficulties," said the mother. Neither parent knew how many times a day Semyon ate, if at all. The accused mother explained that she didn't think that lack of food would be dangerous for him. They also had no money for diapers for Semyon, yet the rest of the children had everything they needed. Financial troubles in the family seemed to apply only to the youngest son, and of course there was always enough money for alcohol. As a result, Semyon, who hadn't yet turned 2, ended up in intensive care with a diagnosis of protein energy malnutrition. The parents were barely persuaded to let doctors take him, fearing that all their children might be removed from their care because of Semyon. They promised to take him to the hospital themselves, then left home for several days. They were less afraid of losing their children than they were of losing the government benefits they relied on for food, drink, and luxuries Semyon never tasted. Fortunately, they returned, and the boy was admitted to the hospital just in time. There, alongside his primary diagnosis, doctors again found signs of abuse. No fewer than 27 blows had been inflicted on Semyon shortly before his hospitalization, mostly to the head, delivered by hands, feet, and unidentified hard objects. In his short life, Semyon spent nearly a year in hospitals in the baby home. If he hadn't been returned to his abusive parents, he would still be alive and healthy today, because outside of his own home, he was treated kindly. Investigators confirmed that Semyon was constantly beaten. Why? For discipline, kicks to the face, head, and body, blows with hands or whatever was within reach. His drunken mother threw the little boy around like a rag doll, dunked him in a bucket, holding his head under water with her foot, forced him to clean up after himself. He'd learned to spit shortly before his death, she said. How did he clean up? By licking the floor. She would throw him into the bathtub with his dirty clothes and make him wash them. A child of 2 or 3 made to wash clothes. His father was no better. Remember, Semyon was only a year, 2 years, 3. His parents didn't give him a chance to grow older. The boy slept on the kitchen floor, sometimes, according to the parents, naked on the bare linoleum. Sometimes, they claimed, because he might go to the bathroom in his sleep. Diapers were too expensive. Alcohol was more important. The father casually told the court that the child had a habit of sleeping in a fetal position. This was how he tried to explain the constant bruises on the child's face, saying he curled up, pressing his face against his legs, and hurt himself. Or maybe it was just too cold for the boy on the bare floor. The father dismissed this with indignation, insisting that the apartment was always warm. The other children in the Taratuta family had beds of their own. We shared the beatings about 50-50, the father explained in court. A few times a week. But when she was drunk, she hit him way too hard, maybe once a month. She punched Semyon in the back, threw him against the wall, dropped him into the bathtub from her height, threw him at me. His head could have cracked open. Anastasia would hit him on the lips and ears. Those parts turned black, Alexander recounted. He went on to say that he and his wife would tie Semyon up and tease him with food, recording the scene on video. We were trying to make some funny content, he said, smirking at the court. In the courtroom, an argument broke out between Anastasia and Alexander, and it came out that she had often thrown the boy out into the stairwell during arguments, yelling, "Get out and take your crap with you." The court also learned from the parents that Semyon didn't react much to the constant beatings. He might let out a small whimper, but usually he stayed quiet, the father explained, because he was born premature. His nerves weren't fully developed. He didn't feel pain. He even ate his own feces, Alexander said with a grin. When a person is beaten repeatedly, they eventually stop feeling the pain because the nerve endings stop responding and even atrophy. This seemed to be the case with Semyon. And after being starved for 3 years, I think you understand. But what parts atrophied in these two monsters who subjected their tiny, defenseless child to such torment and ultimately killed him? That question remains unanswered. And it's doubtful anyone will ever find an answer. Witnesses, namely the neighbors, testified in court that Anastasia was often intoxicated, with a heavy habit of drinking. One neighbor recounted hearing the mother through the walls, yelling and cursing at the child, with distinct sounds resembling slaps. Another neighbor said she had heard the father calling Semyon a cross-eyed degenerate, and Anastasia referring to her son as a loser. The neighbors even reported the abuse to the police multiple times, saying that the child was being beaten day and night, but there was no response. Reminiscent of the horrific case of Vera Pektelova, who was murdered over 3 hours in her own apartment without intervention. This case was even referenced in a video, with a hint in the top right corner of the screen, as well as in the description and pinned comment. Social services visited the family multiple times, and on several occasions even removed the children, only to eventually return them. Semyon was hardly ever taken outside, and on the rare occasions he was, his outings were marred by yelling and beatings. According to one neighbor, he didn't even have a stroller. Little Semyon essentially had to survive within his own family, a struggle in which he had tragically few allies. According to the older brother, Daniil, the youngest boy had his own designated plate, cup, and spoon, and their mother personally fed him 3 times a day. Yet Semyon always seemed hungry, and the other children were forbidden from giving him any additional food. On the night of January 14th, 2023, Daniil was with his mother in the kitchen, while his father, Alexander, was putting the younger daughter to bed. Semyon had an accident on the floor, which infuriated his drunken mother, Anastasia. She began shouting, calling Alexander in to clean up after their son. Alexander entered the kitchen and kicked Semyon in the forehead, causing the boy to fall and hit his head on the floor, but he got back up immediately. Alexander kicked him again in the face, making Semyon hit his head against the refrigerator. Yet again, he managed to stand up. At that point, Anastasia hit him about 7 times on the head until Semyon no longer stood up. But it wasn't enough for Alexander. He clamped the small, defenseless child between his legs and squeezed his frail body. The boy gasped and lost consciousness. When they realized they'd gone too far, they carried him to the bathroom, hoping to revive him by splashing cold water, but it was already too late. Semyon didn't regain consciousness. They washed the blood from him and laid him in a crib they'd bought just a week before his death. It was as if, to rest in a cozy bed rather than on the bare floor, the poor child had to die. Between November 2022 and January 14, 2023, it became evident that the parents had already been actively harming their youngest son. After Semyon's death, it was found that a traumatic brain hemorrhage had occurred several days before he passed. Medical findings indicated that, on the day of his death, Semyon had been struck in the head at least 7 times, which caused a closed skull fracture, bleeding under the meninges, and directly into brain tissue, complicated by swelling of both the brain and spinal cord. This ultimately killed him. Semyon's small body bore no uninjured skin. He had been beaten continually. His father admits that, on that fateful night, he might have overdone it. His mother also admitted to kicking him in the left temple area of his head. However, she isn't exactly sure if it happened on the day he died or on any other day, because the beatings were so constant, it was hard to keep track. She does, however, clearly remember that she only hit him once on the day he died.
The Minsk Regional Court in the Slutsk district has sentenced Anastasia and Alexander Taratuta, who for 3 years subjected their young son Semyon to severe abuse before ultimately killing him. 48-year-old Alexander Taratuta has been sentenced to death. 37-year-old Anastasia Taratuta received the maximum sentence permitted for women, 25 years in a high-security prison, along with compulsory alcohol rehabilitation. Criminal cases have also been opened against all officials involved in this case, those who had the power, and more importantly, the duty to prevent this terrible death. The children, Gloria, Milena, and Danil, were sent to a shelter following their parents' arrest. Danil was then placed with a guardian family, taken in by his father's brother, while Milena and Gloria were placed with a foster family. The guardianship authorities have begun the process of permanently revoking the parental rights of Alexander and Anastasia. Belarusian law ensures that such parents have no opportunity to raise their own children again. Once the Taratutas' parental rights are legally terminated, the children will be eligible for adoption. But first, the children will receive thorough psychological support. The parents' treatment of Semyon took a severe toll on the mental well-being of his siblings, as they witnessed the abuse and tragic death of their brother. Let us honor the memory of little Semyon, who endured so much in his short life. Take care of yourselves and your loved ones.